All right, then. You're in school. I'm in school. I happen to be in school in Tennessee working on my doctorate. Isn't that something? We'll see if I can finish that before I'm 100. And you're here today thanks to whomever it is that's assisting you in this video. This is the lesson on the Declaration of Independence. You have the handouts. I gave them to you last week. You should have those open right now. There are many fill in the blanks. This is a somewhat long lesson. I expect it to go as much as an hour and a half. And if I quit talking right now, we'll get started. So let's launch in. Make sure your slides are open, and here we go. The United States was founded based on a number of foundational documents, very, very important documents that give us an indication of what our nation really is about. The Magna Carta, which set up the relationship between kings and the elected parliament. For instance, the Mayflower Compact that set up the purpose for coming to America, and mentioned, of course, serving Jesus Christ as part of that. The writings of the Founding Fathers, there are so many documents that, had we enough time, we could read through, not in this class, in a lifetime. You will never exhaust the number of documents. I know that makes your day. The Declaration of Independence, which is going to be our primary focus today, is critical to understanding our form of government and the ideas upon which it was built. And the Articles of the Confederation, the way that the country organized itself after the Revolutionary War, which were eventually found to be too weak and had to be rewritten. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is a foundational document in our study for a couple of primary purposes. We're going to spend a very short amount of time on that to catch a couple of key issues of the day. And there were, of course, several other documents like that. We don't spend time with them. And then the United States Constitution. To understand our form of government, we kind of have to have a feel for all of this. Otherwise, we're going to misinterpret what our country really is all about. So let's talk a little bit about the Northwest Ordinance and the Northwest Territories. This was a tract of land that existed in the 1780s, in that era. For the subdivision of the New West, this proposal was contemporary with the Ordinance of 1784 for the government of Northwest Territory, blah, blah, blah. But look at the geological layout here, if you will. Sylvania was the name of one of those. We're not going to spend a lot of time. I just want you to see the way it looked. Out of the Northwest Ordinance was carved several states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and you'll notice a little chunk of Minnesota. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, this is a factoid I want you to know because of a very significant part of the Northwest Ordinance, was signed into law by the Continental Congress on, look at the date, there's a blank on your outline there in your book. You want to write that in, circle it, point at it, learn that date, July 13th, 1787. The significance of it was this: about 2 months later, after the signing of the Northwest Ordinance, the Constitution was passed. So the Northwest Ordinance predated the Constitution by a couple of months. And you'll see why I think that's really, really important in just a moment. Principles established in the Northwest Ordinance reflect the tenor of the times. And by that, I mean the attitude that the founders as a group had toward critical issues. One of those critical issues in particular. The Northwest Ordinance, well, actually more than one, a few. The primary purpose of the Northwest Ordinance was to establish territorial government in the Northwest Territories. In other words, you had this raw land that was out there, lightly inhabited by indigent, is that the right word? People, by, frontiersmen and native I don't like the word Native Americans, the original inhabitants, when the found, you know what I'm talking about. Okay. To establish territorial government in the Northwest Territories. That was its purpose, and to provide a means of acquisition of land by the people who settled on the land and create procedures for the territories to become states. So they wrote the Northwest Ordinance to organize, if you will, organize the land, organize the people, get them ready to become states. This was even before the Constitution was written or finished. There was one very prominent feature in the Northwest Ordinance. I want to get your arms wrapped around this. And it was an indicator of the value, now listen, the value placed on all human beings. What has the North to do with slavery, this cartoon? The Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in the Northwest Territories. So even before our Constitution was signed, in which there was no banning, if you will, of slavery, there was actually a device set up in the original Constitution to eliminate slavery. By the way, we'll study that in a week or two. But the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in the Northwest Territories. So think about that. The 13 colonies, some of which were slave states, agreed and ratified this treaty, if you will, and established the Northwest Ordinance banning slavery in the Northwest Territories. That was 2 months before the Constitution was completed. There is only one article from the Northwest Ordinance that we're going to spend any time on. Again, the purpose is to give you an idea of the tenor of the times, the way people thought. And it starts this way. It's Article 3, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of all mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Now think about that. We'll come back to that in a moment. The utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. So that's what they called the people who inhabited the territories. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. I'm not sure they followed through on that. And in their property rights and liberty, they never shall be invaded or disturbed unless in just and lawful war is authorized by Congress. But and I'm not an expert, by the way, on the Indian Wars, and it may be that when the federal government or state governments went to war with the Indians, they actually did get decrees authorizing it by Congress, so they obeyed the law here. I've never studied that. Maybe I should. But laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them, being done to the Indians, and for preserving peace and friendship with them. So one of the aims of the Northwest Ordinance then was to establish relationships with the Indians, if you will, to treat them with dignity and friendship. But what I really wanted to focus on was this first sentence, just a little bit. Religion, morality, and knowledge. 3 particular things. I'm going to warn you, I want you to memorize that. So if I ever ask you on a quiz or a test, you'll be able to write that in. Religion, morality, and knowledge. Being necessary to good government. These 3 aspects, religion, morality, and knowledge, the founders saw were necessary for good government and the happiness of mankind. And for those purposes, schools and education are forever encouraged. So they're tying religion and morality and knowledge together with happiness and with good government. Given our study of Christian worldview, that's not surprising, because the founders thought that our form of government was only fit for a moral and religious people. So here they are laying it out in this new territory, even before the Constitution was ratified, that religion, morality, and knowledge were necessary, not suggested or hoped for or anything, but necessary. You can overlay that with today and ask yourself the question about the influence of religion, morality, and even knowledge. I think that we could argue that knowledge has failed because religion and morality are failing. But that's a discussion for another time. Religion, morality, and knowledge required for good government and happiness. And that was to be transmitted to Americans through an educated citizenry. Our founders believed very strongly that they needed educated people. In 1804, one of the descendants of the DuPont family, Pierre DuPont, wrote that even the farmer in his field plowing is reading Descartes. In other words, even the farmers, in fact, 96% literacy already by the early 1800s. That's pretty remarkable. Now, here's one of the interesting factoids. I believe it was 1987, the 200th anniversary of our Constitution, Michigan, a Michigan school board body tried to amend the Northwest Ordinance of 200 years earlier because it mentioned the word religion, and something had changed. We learned about that last week, the attitude of the federal government toward the influence of religion. So, I mean, it's astonishing to think that they would try to do this 200 years after, that it would be offensive to them that the word religion would be included in one of our founding documents. How absurd is that? Religion, when they say religion, what they're talking about is the free practice of religious faith, of paying homage to God through the dictates of each heart as being critical. Now, there's many Catholics, perhaps even in this classroom, they're certainly at Yale Academy and across the country. Well over 40% of the population is Catholic. So this is not intended to offend anybody. I suppose I'm supposed to be politically correct about this. There's a lot of Muslims and Hindus and others too. But when they're talking about religion at the founding, it was mostly Protestant. It was the Protestants who primarily settled the United States. Yet they were tolerant of all forms of Protestantism, I can't say it, Protestantism, there you go, Protestantism, and other forms of Christian faith. They were not always tolerant of Roman Catholics. There's quite a bit of evidence in the late 1800s of discrimination, outright discrimination against people, primarily because they were Catholic. So we've had issues with that sort of thing throughout our history. 6 states were carved out of it. Those were Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. I used to call us mini-Soviet. That was in the days of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the extension of Russia. People understood the joke then. Minnesota, mini-Soviet means a state where everything is regulated, I guess. It's a joke. Okay, it's not funny. I'll move on. And then, of course, we get to the primary purpose for this lesson. The finishing of and signing of the Declaration of Independence. And traditionally, we say July 4th, 1776. I know the purists will tell you it was finished July 2nd, 1776. It was announced publicly July 4th, 1776. The signers did not finish signing until August. Okay, so for those of you who are technically, want to be really technical about your history, please just use July 4th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence, which I call America's Creed. Now, here's one of my picky little history lessons. When we say who wrote the Declaration of Independence, they will always say Thomas Jefferson. Well, not technically correct. There's actually a committee of 5 founders who had editorial control over the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson penned it. In other words, he wrote it. And so I might say to you on a quiz, who penned the Declaration of Independence? And you'll say Thomas Jefferson. And then I will say, well, who wrote it? And you won't say Thomas Jefferson. You'll say the Committee of 5. And this is just to correct a little misperception that Thomas Jefferson is the great thought leader who shaped our country all by himself. Not true. It's true that he wrote the drafts of the Declaration, but the Committee of 5, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, I think it's Robert Livingston, and John Adams all had influence and reviewed the document before it was presented. Of the 31 charges listed, now when we get into the Declaration, you'll see how it's structured. And you know, it's in that little brown book that I gave you. I don't have a copy here to show you, but you know what I mean. It's the Declaration and the Constitution. Of the 31 charges that were originally listed on the early drafts of the Declaration, 2 of them were removed. One of them was a strong rebuke to the King of England for his tolerance of the slave trade. Why is that important for you to know? Just like with banning slavery in the Northwest Territories in 1776, that's even 11 years before the Northwest Ordinance, here was the Founding Fathers rebuking the king for allowing the slave trade to go on. Now, this did not stick in the final declaration, and the reasons were political. And this is real world. This is not theoretical, where everything happens the way we wish it did. In order to get the southern states, the slaveholding states, to sign on to the Declaration of Independence, they had to take that phrase out, and the issue of slavery was set aside at that time. But it's very important that you know that, I think. Another thing that's really important, I believe, and central to the success of the Revolution was the printing press. In 1776, the printing press was a couple hundred years old, or actually, I think, I can't remember the date of the Gutenberg press, but the printing press was still a relatively young device. It wasn't like what you have today, connected to a smartphone where you could print thousands of copies of color printing on both sides. You know, it was a fixed type, clumsy device, required a lot of work to get it set up. And a man named John Dunlop printed copies of the Declaration and widely circulated them throughout the colonies. This was an incredibly important part of our revolution. Just by printing those copies, he probably put his life in jeopardy. But think of it as the power of a free press. What if the British government had controlled the media at this time and said, you know, that the only thing that could get published is what they approved of? And that is the way it is in many totalitarian countries even today. Although with the internet, it's pretty hard to police all that. But this is pretty amazing when you think about the effects of the printing press and distribution of this document freely throughout the colonies. How else would they have known of it? So very, very important. The Declaration of Independence I have entitled America's Creed, and that's because it expresses the religious beliefs, if you will, the spiritual beliefs of the Founding Fathers, and how they applied to civil government. When people argue that we are not a Christian nation or we're not founded as a Christian nation, frankly, it's their ignorance of or express purpose to ignore what's really in the Declaration of Independence and the other founding documents. It just is not so. It is America's creed. It does lay out the philosophical basis for the revolution, for the separation from England, a very, very important document. Y'all might throw a glance to the wall. Let's see, what wall is that? The west wall in the room. You'll see a big Declaration of Independence on a foam core board that actually came from an event in 1995 up in New Hampshire. And if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll notice it's signed by Alan Keyes. Alan Keyes was an ambassador to the United Nations, an assistant secretary in Ronald Reagan's, one of his departments, and a candidate for president in 95, 96, an African-American. I was his national campaign manager. This is one of the few things I was able to keep from the campaign. I'm very proud of it, and I'm glad to show it to you. I love the Declaration. Now, this is the first paragraph, if you will, of the Declaration of Independence. You'll want to make sure that you have written in your assignments. You don't have to do it now, but don't forget this, because when I get back next week, I'm going to test you on it. I want you to memorize this. There's 2 sections, actually 3 sections in the Declaration I'm going to have you memorize. This is the first one. Normally when I'm there, we say it all together. I won't ask you to do that. That would be embarrassing without me in the room. But as I'm reading it, pay a little attention, will you? When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Again, I want you to memorize that. We're going to pick it apart a bit now. Why did they have to write the Declaration, by the way? Well, it was a legal document. I believe you need to fill in those little blanks there, LD, legal document. It dealt with trade issues. They needed the world, if you will, to understand that these 13 tiny colonies, these weak, unknown foreign colonies way across the seas, had legal standing to decide their own fate, that they had the legal right to trade directly with the colonies without going through Great Britain. This was a huge declaration economically, setting them apart and telling the world that it was now legal for them to deal with the colonies without going through Great Britain. It was very natural for those other countries to fear Great Britain, the greatest military power on the earth, more than to respect the feeble claims of a few rebellious colonists. Just think about that. So they put the Declaration out there and they said, hey, we're free, start dealing with us. Big deal, really big deal. And it was a legal document that lays out the reasons that they can make that claim. So let's start with this. In the course of human events, that's pretty plain if you just read it as it is. It means as things happen in history, if you look at the history of mankind, as things happen in history, you end up with political bands. And political bands are the agreements between nations that we might call treaties, or by conquest, you respect a certain border until you go and capture the bad guys on the other side and take it over. But anyway, the political bands are the agreements between nations as to government. And to assume among the powers of the earth, by this they're saying all governments. In other words, as things go on in history, there's agreements between governments, and we're going to assume power among all the governments of the world, the separate and equal station. In other words, we are going to be an independent nation equal to Britain. The laws of nature. Now here we see one of the first indicators of the Christian worldview that informed the Declaration. The laws of nature and of nature's God. Natural law, as you learned when you read American Christians in Government, is the law that God created from the beginning, the natural order of things and the natural way that people relate to each other. And then of nature's God, which included the 10 Commandments, the Mosaic Law, and all the other things that you might find in Scripture. These then are the reasons that they're writing the Declaration, to make the legal case, if you will, for separation. They're making the legal case. As things happen in history, there's agreements between nations, and we want to assume a place among all governments that's separate and equal, independent from Britain. We're relying on natural law. We're relying on the laws of nature's God. Now they explain their creed. This is the second paragraph in the Declaration. You are also to memorize this. This is just filled with philosophy that's very important for you to grasp hold of. Here it goes. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You've heard this many times before. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Very, very important. It talks about self-evident truth. Today's even postmodernists, way beyond, I don't even know what the term is anymore, reject self-evident truth. They tend to make it up. It's very contradictory. The founders believed in self-evident truth, that much of life can be known and it can be understood through observation. It's self-evident. Think of gravity. If you were to drop your pencil right now, what would happen? You know it would fall to the floor. If you were to quit breathing, you know what would happen. Well, actually, you can't quit breathing. Just go ahead and try. When you faint, you'll start breathing again. Yeah, I added this one. Gender differences is also self-evident truth. I won't go any deeper with that. We actually have a lesson on that in another course I teach. These are self-evident truths. And there are theological convictions, such as the existence of God, that the founders believed to be self-evident truth. There is a God. We're not him. And therefore, we have to pay attention to it. So how many of you this morning got up and decided to start breathing? You know, how many of you had anything to do with your birth? There's certain self-evident truths there, things over which you have no control whatsoever. I think some of you might say, well, I have no control of being enrolled in this class. My mom made me do it. Okay, that's not funny. True, but not funny. Without getting all confused, self-evident truth, theological convictions also were self-evident to the founders. They said that all men, the word all is an interesting word. If I were in the classroom today, I would ask you, what does all mean? And you would say all, everybody. That's pretty self-evident. It's a universal truth. It's not just an American truth. It's universal, what they're about to say, all. And then they use the word men. And by this, they mean mankind. They're not talking about the male sex. They're not talking about men. They're talking about mankind. Bit of a raspy throat today. You got to stop for water now and then. So they're saying all men, all mankind are created equal. Now, granted, in our original laws, we did not create, we didn't treat women as equal under the law in the way we understand it 100 years ago when they passed the 19th Amendment and gave women the right to vote, establishing many more legal equalities. This did not have to do with the nature of human beings at the founding. It had to do with the way they organized society. It's a different context. So all men are created equal. All humans are created equal. And here's a really, really, really critical pair of words, are created. There cannot be any equality without going through the Creator. When Alan Keyes, when I first heard him do a talk on this, I like the way he said this, that we are all created. And then he paused. And then he said equal, because you can't get to equality without going through the Creator. The Declaration assumes a worldview based on divine creation, on the equality and dignity and value of human life. It did not assume a worldview based on some evolutionary process where we came out of the lake equal with all other fish. That is not at all what our Declaration assumes. It assumes that we were created by a Creator, and that's what made us equal. To get to equality, then you have to go through the Creator. Equality of mankind is and was a revolutionary idea in that era that is fully dependent on divine creation. Without divine creation, there is no equality. There is only survival of the fittest. The strongest will rule. Evolution then rests fully on this ideal of survival of the fittest. The strongest will survive. Inequality, if you will, a natural inequality. So here's a revolutionary doctrine for governments, that we're all created equal, and as a result, we've been endowed by our Creator. Now, an endowment is an interesting term. An endowment is a trust of some value. It's money usually is the way we use it. We might say that in your families you've been endowed with the family name, with the family reputation. Sometimes it's not so good, but what this is really talking about is a gift of some value that's given to an institution. And it increases in value, and the increase in value is used to benefit everyone, and most often commonly thought of with nonprofit organizations in, let's say, essentially like a college or university. And think about this. Someone puts $1 million in an endowment fund, and the school has stewardship over that money, and their job is to make it grow. And they make it grow by investing it, and then the investment, the amount that they get back in return, the interest or from selling assets or whatever, that gain is then used to fund the school, while the endowment is left in place to feed future growth. So I'm giving you kind of a confused thing, but I wanted you to kind of understand when they say that we've been endowed by the Creator, this is a very, very meaningful term. It's like the gift of the talents in the New Testament. We have been given a trust, and it's our job to improve that trust, to increase it in value, and to use it to benefit everyone. Do you see how powerful that statement is? We have been created equal. We've been endowed by that Creator to do something. And here, when we say endowed by the Creator, it's the specific mention of the source of our rights, that our rights do not come from government. Our rights come from God. There is no question that the founders understood that our rights, our life, our beings, all came from God, from the Creator, in the context of the founding of the nation. No question. They talked about unalienable rights. And if you think about that, what's an alienable right? Well, an alienable right would be a right that can be alienated, taken away. What's an unalienable right? And by the way, that was the way they spelled it. We sometimes say inalienable. I probably will let you use either form. Rights that cannot be alienated. You receive these rights without asking. None of you asked to be born. You were given life by the union of your mother and father, and a natural process. You can't give it away. You can take your life. You can make bad judgments and have your life taken from you by violating the rights of others, but you can't give away your life. They can't take it away except, as I said, when you violate someone else's unalienable rights. So there are rights that cannot be alienated. You get them without asking. It's like breathing. You didn't ask to breathe. You can't give away your right to breathe. And nobody can take away your right to breathe unless you've taken away someone else's right to breathe, and then you have the death penalty, and that's another discussion. So among these, they only list 3. Notice the word among. They're not saying these are the only 3 unalienable rights, but these are the 3 that they mention: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And by life, there is no question. What they meant was human life, not animal life, not plant life, not Mother Earth, not the universe, human life. They're talking about from conception until death by natural causes. There is no question that, and if you read back in the history and common law, way back into the 5th and 4th centuries even, talking about protecting human life. There's no question that abortion would not have been approved of at the beginning, that they believed in protecting human life. And then liberty. Liberty would be the right to choose, if you will, to choose where you live, to choose with whom you live, what you do, where you do it, where you go, who goes with you, and in a political sense, of course, whom you support. This quote that I put up here, remember I told you the story about Tom Bird being in prison for almost 20 years. The day he got out of prison, Pastor Ken Cody, our mutual friend, called him and asked him what he was doing. He said he was in a store buying clothes. He was not going to buy blue shirts or blue jeans, by the way, because he had worn them in prison for 20 years. Didn't want them anymore. And he had the liberty to choose whatever color pants or shirts he wanted. But this was the thing he said to me. My wife and I walked across a college campus today and there were no fences. You say, wow, that seems silly. It's terrifically profound when you've been locked up for 20 years. I walked in prison with Tom. The most he could walk was about, well, in the visiting area, about 50 feet. He could walk within the prison, but he could not walk outside those walls or outside those fences. He could see everybody else out there, but he couldn't do it. So for him, liberty at that day, that first day, meant that he could walk across a campus and not have any fences. What a tremendous thing that was for him, along with the steak and eggs that all inmates seem to want when they get out. Liberty in politics really means the political, social, and economic rights that belong to the citizens. All rights belong to the citizens. We're endowed by our Creator with those unalienable rights. They're not endowed to government. They're endowed to us as individuals. So in politics, liberty means the political, social, and economic rights that belong to citizens. These are the rights of citizens to choose the form of governments that they desire. Think how revolutionary that was in 1776. Think how revolutionary that is in Cuba today, or Argentina today, or almost anywhere else. So many nations that do not allow people the liberty to make their own decisions. The rights then start with the people. They don't start with the king or the state. All rights come from God, Creator God. They start with then the people and outwardly are extended to the government as the people, as we the people allow it to happen. And then it talks about the pursuit of happiness. Now this might be your first thought. Oh, what's that thing she's got? It's a phone with a cord. Golly, I bet nobody's ever even seen one of those in this room. I got to get a new picture. Wow. And I think that's surfing. Anyway, that's not what's meant by the pursuit of happiness. What the founders actually meant, and they almost used this term, was the pursuit of virtue, the right to pursue a virtuous life. They, you know, it's a long list of attributes that goes way beyond happiness, pure happiness. Although one of the things that you'll find in the Fourth and 14th Amendments and elsewhere is the right to own property. And so many equate this an unalienable right to life, liberty, and the right to property as unalienable rights. And this is, again, revolutionary, that your mom and dad can own a plot of land, that it's theirs to do with as they please within the regulatory process of their city or town, that they can own not only that piece of dirt, but a house they build on it, that they can put a little farm, if you will, on it if they wish. They can gain by the property they own. They could own a business, and they could earn money, and they can get a paycheck, or they can get a return on investment by the sweat of their brow. They had the right to own property. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness is not, if you will, equal outcomes. And this has been a misinterpretation of the founding concepts of our nation in modern times, that everybody has the right to everything on an equal basis. That is not at all what an unalienable right means. The pursuit of happiness is not equal outcomes. It's equal opportunities, if you will, or opportunity, maybe not even equal opportunities. The opportunity, though, not to be hindered by government in the pursuit of life, liberty, and property. These are unalienable rights. Very, very important. So let's move beyond those clauses now to the body of the Declaration. The first thing it says is that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Why do governments exist? What is the purpose? What is the purpose of government? Say it with me. To secure these rights. To secure these rights. To secure what rights? The rights that are mentioned as unalienable. What are those unalienable rights? The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is the purpose of government? To secure unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is the source of the right to govern? The Declaration says, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We, the people. Government, its purpose is to protect our individual and corporate unalienable rights, and the power to do so comes from our consent, the consent of the government. This was a revolutionary idea. When then can there be justifiable rebellion? When can a nation issue a document to separate itself from the government that owns them and declare equality? What conditions are required then? Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends. Destructive to what ends? Destructive to the right of the people to consent and denying unalienable rights. The securing of unalienable rights to the citizens, the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then, when governments become destructive of these ends, the founders said it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. That's the condition. And to institute new government. So the condition is that Great Britain was denying people their unalienable rights, and they were violating the right of the people to consent to their own government. So the people had the right to alter or abolish the government and to what? Institute new government. So they had the right to separate and the right to institute new government and lay the foundations, if you will, of the new government on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. In other words, this is like taking original King James language, I know, from the Bible. The people have the right, when their unalienable rights are being denied, when they no longer have been consenting to the government, to get rid of that government, to create new government, to build the foundations on the ideas that they believe are going to make them safe and happy. There's a very serious caution here, and that's why things don't happen quickly. Prudence, the word prudence, being careful, being very, very careful, circumspect, not making a rash decision. Prudence, indeed, will dictate. Governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Now, I usually ask how many of you have ever flown on a plane. If I was in the room, I bet all of you would put your hands up. And then I would say, how many of you have crashed and died? And obviously that's a stupid question because you're all sitting there in the room. And why do I use that? Because after 9/11, when planes flew into big towers, the United States issued a new law, the U.S. Patriot Law, which limited in many, many ways travel and other things. And they changed the way that we get on airplanes. So now we have to go through those lines. You've never lived without them. We did. We used to be able to walk right up to the gate and so forth and check in right where we get on the plane and so forth. But because of that event where people lost their lives, almost 3,000 on September 11th, Golly, when is this lesson being done? 7/9, today's 9/10, just that'll be tomorrow for you. No, no, 17th. I'm sorry, I'm getting dates and it's irrelevant. My point is, planes don't fly into towers very regularly, but because they did, we gave up some of our rights. Now, were those light and transient causes? Were they something that was only going to happen once, or did we have to do that to protect ourselves? Anyway, we shouldn't change our government just because things happen and react out of panic, if we will. It's like, frankly, it's like the argument over Second Amendment gun rights right now, because there have been terrible, tragic abuses of people shooting down people with what they call semi-automatic or automatic look-like weapons. Now we're going to have to ban them all. These cannot be light and transient causes. They have to be serious and taken over time. All experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. In other words, these things over time, history proves that people will put up with a lot before they make major changes. Remember here, the founders are trying to justify to the world why they are changing their government, why they're throwing off the shackles of the Great Britain and becoming independent. They're saying history shows that after, people are going to put up with a lot for a long time before you finally hit that place where, ain't going to happen anymore, we've got to change. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. Now, you're seeing one of my favorite words in all of the English language. I love the word usurpation, just because it sounds fun, okay? But what are we talking about? We're talking about violations of the rights of unalienable rights. We're talking about government without representation, usurpations. In other words, taking away our right to self-govern. And so when there's been a long history of this, that even though we put up with it for a long time, we're at the point no longer where we're going to put up with it because we've seen over and over and over and over and over that Great Britain is not going to respect our sovereignty and so forth. That's what they're saying here, with the purpose of putting them under the authority permanently of Great Britain. Then, finally, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. After this proof of abuses and usurpations over time, now they can say it's their right, it's their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. In other words, get rid of what we know is being detrimental to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and robbing us of our right to consent to government. And we're going to get rid of it. It's our right to do it. It's not only our right, it's our duty to get rid of it and to provide new guards for our future security. And so it wasn't just those, fancy words in philosophy. They laid out the proof. Now, originally I said there were 31 and one of them was struck, actually two of them were struck. People count them differently. But if you read the Declaration now, I'm using the number 27, others do too. There's a whole list of these usurpations in the document. And it talked about them taking unwarranted actions against the colonies and refusing to take responsible actions, ignoring them, levying taxes, putting troops in their domiciles, having British troops live among them and so forth. I'm going to let you write this down or circle it and make sure that you understand that for next week, this is part of your assignment. I want you to read the Declaration top to bottom. I want you to memorize those first two paragraphs, but I also want you to read these 27 charges. You'll find them after these words we just went through, and I want you to rewrite them in your own words. So it says this, this is what it means to me. I want you to try to get your arms around what they were really complaining about. in the case they were making. They were talking about Parliament refusing to address their concerns, and instead British Parliament was punishing them. They were talking about taxation without representation, having taxes levied against them over which they had nothing to say, and much else. That's what I want you to identify. All right, so they're appealing to whom? The Supreme Judge, which is one of the mentions of God, if you will. It understood clearly in their day that God and Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, were one together, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the universe. They're submitting themselves to God's judgment, that they will be absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. This is the declaration right here, that the political connection is dissolved, no more. So besides appealing to God, they sought firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Another mention of God in the Declaration, divine providence, was the hand of God that created, was the God of creation that gave us our rights, our unalienable rights, and set up the right of individuals to govern themselves and gave us liberty and so forth. They're appealing to that judge, the Supreme Judge, and relying on his providence. I think I have one more thing coming up here in a second that I've got to remember. Okay, who were the founding fathers? Think about it. You only know the names of some. I don't know if any of you have ever done the study of each one. I have not, and I probably should. Have done studies of some of these. Thomas Jefferson, of course, is well known. Ben Franklin, who was at both the Declaration and Constitution writing. John Adams and his cousin Sam Adams. Sam Adams was the instigator, if you will. He was the correspondent. He was the one that urged John Adams, his cousin, to really engage. Sam Adams is not just the name of a beer. If you don't know what that means, that's good. But it is a brand name of a beer. Sam Adams, and the reason I'm telling you this is when I ask people who I, Dave Racer, who I the most like of the founders, they'll say Sam Adams, okay? Sherman, Wilson, Benjamin Rush, who was a physician, Jonathan Witherspoon, who was the first president of Princeton University and a pastor. There were half of these men were graduates of seminaries, Christian Protestant seminaries, and they pledged their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor. And that is the passage at the end of the Declaration that I want you to memorize, where it talks about their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor. And many of them did, in fact, die. Many of them went insane. Many of them lost their entire fortune. They lost their families. But some of them became our first presidents and justices of the Supreme Court and diplomats to foreign nations and members of Congress and business owners and leaders. And they, there's this perception that there was a popular uprising in America. Well, that's not true. It said as many as 80% in the New York colony opposed this move toward independence. This was a small group of strong leaders who influenced and led a rebellion, and they paid dearly for it. And after they paid for it, they performed service in honor of the new nation. This is America's creed, the Declaration of Independence. I trust that this short glimpse, if you will, and the little book that you read, America's Creed, will light your fire on how important this document is, and it'll become something very, very important to you in your lives as you move forward, as it is for me. For me, teaching this lesson is almost like preaching a sermon. I just love it. And I love you all, and I'm looking forward to being back with you next week. Make sure that you get your assignments done, and hey, we'll see you then. God bless you all.